President Trump just made an announcement that changes everything, not just for his campaign, but for the way America confronts one of its oldest enemies, the cartels. What he said wasn't just another promise, it was a declaration of intent. And whether you love him or hate him, what comes next will redefine national security, border policy, and even how presidents use power. Today, we're breaking it all down. What Trump announced, why Democrats are panicking, and how this moment could reshape American politics and impact your life. Because most people have no idea what's about to happen. What happened wasn't a typical Rose Garden press conference with carefully scripted talking points and polite applause. This was Trump standing in front of law enforcement officials, military personnel, and members of his Homeland Security Task Force, and publicly confirming something that took Washington by complete surprise. In his first 9 months back in office, his administration arrested a record number of cartel members and foreign terrorists operating on U.S. soil. We're talking about between 70 and 90 tons of deadly narcotics seized, over 1,000 illegal weapons recovered, and not just small-time street dealers, but high-level operatives tied to international cartels that have been poisoning American communities for decades. Think about that for a second. 70 to 90 tons. That's not a back alley bust. That's the equivalent of filling 4 full-size semi-trucks with narcotics that were destined for American streets, American schools, American neighborhoods. This wasn't a speech, it was a signal. A signal that Washington's old approach, endless committee meetings, diplomatic negotiations that go nowhere, polite letters asking foreign governments to please help us, was officially over. And here's where it gets interesting, because what came next, nobody saw coming. You see, Trump didn't just announce the arrests. He made it clear that his administration was willing to do what previous administrations refused to do. He authorized lethal strikes against cartel operations in international waters. Not on American soil, not in densely populated cities, but out at sea, where drug trafficking vessels operate with impunity, knowing that for decades, the U.S. government was too cautious, too worried about optics, too paralyzed by bureaucracy to act decisively. Now, I want you to think about this from a first principles perspective. What is the job of a government? At its most basic level, it's to protect its citizens, to secure the borders, to ensure that foreign criminal organizations aren't flooding your communities with drugs that kill tens of thousands of people every year. For years, we've watched a certain drug, which I can't name on YouTube, be so potent that a dose the size of a few grains of salt can kill a grown adult pour across the southern border. We've watched families destroyed. We've seen overdose deaths skyrocket. And what did Washington do? They held hearings, they pointed fingers, they funded studies. But they didn't stop the flow. Trump's announcement wasn't about politics, it was about results. And for many Americans who have lost loved ones to poisoning, who have watched their communities crumble under the weight of cartel violence, this wasn't politics at all. It was justice. Long overdue justice. Now, here's where this all will take a turn. Because while Trump and his team were laying out the numbers, the tons of drugs seized, the weapons confiscated, the lives saved, his opponents were scrambling to change the narrative. You've probably noticed this pattern before. When someone does something that works, that gets real results, the conversation immediately shifts, not to, did it work, but to, was it legal? Was it ethical? Did he follow proper procedure? And that's exactly what happened. Within hours, Democratic lawmakers and media commentators started questioning Trump's authority to conduct these operations. They accused him of executive overreach. They raised concerns about international law. They demanded investigations into whether these lethal strikes were constitutional. Let me ask you something. Do you remember when President Obama used drone strikes overseas to take out suspected terrorists? Do you remember the media calling it illegal? Do you remember congressional Democrats demanding his impeachment for acting without explicit authorization? Neither do I. When Obama used drones to strike targets in Yemen, in Pakistan, in Somalia, the narrative was about decisive leadership, about a president willing to do what was necessary to keep America safe. And to be clear, I'm not saying those strikes were wrong. I'm saying there was a legal framework, however stretched, that allowed them to happen. But when Trump authorizes strikes against cartel vessels in international waters, vessels carrying enough to kill hundreds of thousands of Americans, suddenly it's a constitutional crisis. That's the double standard we're dealing with. And it's not just frustrating, it's dangerous. Because it signals to our enemies that America's political class is more interested in fighting each other than fighting the people who are actively trying to harm us. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Isn't there a risk that this kind of action escalates things? That it leads to more violence? And that's a fair question. But let me flip it around. What happens if we don't act? What happens if we continue down the path of diplomatic letters and toothless sanctions while cartels grow stronger, richer, and more brazen? What happens when they start operating with total impunity because they know the US government is too afraid of bad press to actually stop them? The truth is, inaction has a cost too, a massive cost, measured in lives lost, in communities destroyed, in an entire generation struggling with addiction because we didn't have the courage to confront the source. Trump's approach may be controversial, it may make people uncomfortable, but it's built on a simple premise: protect American citizens first, ask permission later. And here's the thing, the numbers don't lie. This task force has already seized more narcotics in 9 months than some previous administrations did in 4 years. They've arrested more high-level cartel operatives. They've disrupted supply chains that have been operating for decades. Even if you cut those numbers in half, even if you assume there's some exaggeration for political purposes, the results still eclipse anything we've seen in recent memory. So why isn't this the biggest story in America right now? Why aren't we celebrating the fact that our government is finally taking the cartel threat seriously? Because while Trump's task force was breaking records, the media was breaking into full-blown hysteria over something completely different. Something that, on the surface, seems trivial. But beneath the surface, it reveals everything about how power, perception, and politics intersect in modern America. I'm talking about the White House ballroom. Yes, you heard that right. While Trump was dismantling cartel operations and seizing enough substances to fill swimming pools, the press corps was losing their minds over a construction project. Now, renovations at the White House are nothing new. Every president leaves their mark on the building. It's a tradition that goes back centuries. Thomas Jefferson expanded it. Theodore Roosevelt added the West Wing. Harry Truman completely gutted and rebuilt the interior because the structure was literally collapsing. But when Trump announced plans to renovate the East Wing and build a grand ballroom for state functions, diplomatic events, and official ceremonies, the reaction was swift and intense. Headlines screamed about taxpayer money being wasted, editorials questioned his priorities, critics accused him of turning the people's house into his personal palace. Except there was one small detail they conveniently left out. The project was privately funded. That's right. Not a single taxpayer dollar was being used. Major corporations Apple, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and others had contributed to a fund specifically earmarked for this renovation. It was all above board, all legal, all transparent, and yet the outrage continued. Why? Because when the media obsesses over wallpaper and chandeliers, while a president is dismantling international criminal organizations, it tells you exactly where their priorities lie. It also tells you something deeper. It tells you they're afraid, not of the ballroom, but of what the ballroom represents. Throughout history, architecture has always been a statement of power. The Romans built the Colosseum, the French built Versailles, the Americans built the Capitol. These structures weren't just functional, they were symbolic. They announced to the world, we are here, we are strong, and we are not going anywhere. Trump's ballroom renovation is no different. It's a signal that he's not just occupying the White House, he's reclaiming it. He's making it a place that can host world leaders, that can project strength and confidence, that can serve as a stage for American diplomacy for generations to come. And that terrifies his opponents. Because if Trump succeeds in leaving a physical permanent mark on the presidency, it becomes much harder to erase his legacy, much harder to pretend he was just an aberration, much harder to go back to business as usual. So they fixate on the cost, they fixate on the optics, they demand investigations into who donated, why they donated, and whether there's some hidden quid pro quo. But here's the reality. If this were any other president, if this were a Democrat renovating the White House with private funds, it would be celebrated as innovative public-private partnership. It would be praised as fiscal responsibility. Instead, it's treated as a scandal, and the panic spread quickly. It reached Congress within days. Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader in the House, held a press conference where he didn't mince words. He called it the largest pay-to-play scheme in the history of the country. He suggested that corporations were buying influence. He promised investigations. He vowed accountability. Now, let's think about this for a moment. Is it possible that some of these companies hope their donations will be remembered favorably? Sure. That's how the world works. People and organizations build goodwill. They invest in relationships. They support causes and projects they believe in. But is that corruption? Is that illegal? Not unless there's a explicit exchange. Not unless there's proof that a donation brought a specific policy outcome. And so far there's no evidence of that. Just accusations. Just innuendo. But here's the part that should concern all of us. When politicians threaten to investigate private citizens and companies for making legal donations to legal projects simply because they don't like the president those donations are supporting, that's not oversight. That's intimidation. It sends a chilling message. Support the wrong person, and we'll come after you. And that's not how a free society is supposed to work. Meanwhile, while Washington argued over marble floors and crystal chandeliers, something far more significant was unfolding a few hundred miles north in New York City. A political earthquake that almost nobody saw coming. Eric Adams, the current mayor of New York City, a man who ran on a platform of law and order, who promised to restore safety and sanity to the city, stood alongside Andrew Cuomo and did something that shocked both parties. He endorsed Cuomo to be the next mayor. Now, if you're not familiar with New York politics, let me give you some context. Andrew Cuomo was forced to resign as governor just a few years ago amid multiple scandals, including over a dozen allegations of sexual misconduct. His career was supposed to be over, his name was supposed to be toxic. And yet, here he is, running for mayor, with the endorsement of the sitting mayor. What does that tell you? It tells you that something has shifted, that the Democratic establishment in New York is so desperate, so terrified of what's coming, that they're willing to rehabilitate someone they threw overboard just a few years ago. Because the alternative is worse. The alternative is Zohran Mamdani, a candidate so far to the left that he makes previous progressive politicians look moderate by comparison. A candidate who has openly called for defunding the police, releasing thousands of inmates from Rikers Island, freezing rents across the city, and fundamentally restructuring how New York operates. And according to the latest polling, he's ahead. Let that sink in for a moment. The city that was once America's shining example of urban renewal, under Rudy Giuliani, the city that proved you could be compassionate and tough on crime at the same time, is now on the verge of electing someone who believes the entire system needs to be torn down and rebuilt from scratch. How did we get here? The answer is simple, and it's the same answer that explains so much of what's happening in America right now. When leaders fail repeatedly, when they promise solutions and deliver only more problems, people stop trusting the establishment. They stop believing in incremental change. They start looking for someone, anyone, who promises to do things differently. That's how Trump won in 2016. That's how progressive candidates have surged in Democratic primaries. And that's how someone like Mamdani can go from obscure state legislator to frontrunner for mayor of America's largest city. Eric Adams understands this. That's why he stood next to Andrew Cuomo, a man with serious baggage, and said, "This is our best chance." Because, in his mind, Cuomo represents a return to a certain kind of democratic governance. Pragmatic, experienced. willing to work with business leaders and law enforcement. But here's the problem. The people of New York, especially those who have watched their neighborhoods decline, their subway system become dangerous, their cost of living skyrocket, while their quality of life plummeted, aren't looking for a return to the past. They're looking for something radically different. And Mamdani is offering them that vision. During the debate, which aired just the other night, you could see the dynamic play out in real time. Mamdani was calm, smiling, presenting himself as the voice of a new generation. Cuomo was defensive, constantly having to answer questions about his past, about the allegations that forced him from office. The Republican candidate tried hard to make inroads, but struggled to articulate a vision that could compete with either the nostalgia Cuomo offered or the revolution Mamdani promised. And what was most telling was what Mamdani didn't answer. When pressed on specifics, how exactly would you freeze rent without destroying the housing market? How would you keep the city safe with fewer police officers? Where would thousands of released inmates go, and what happens to public safety? He smiled and pivoted to talking points about systemic oppression and the need for transformational change. In other words, he didn't have answers. But he didn't need answers, because to his supporters, the current system is so broken that any change feels like improvement. This is the danger of failure at scale. When governance becomes so ineffective that people lose faith in the entire enterprise, they become willing to gamble on untested ideologies. They become willing to believe that someone with no executive experience, no track record of managing complex organizations, can somehow fix a city of 8.5 million people. Now, I'm not saying Mamdani is a bad person. I'm saying that idealism without pragmatism is dangerous. That good intentions without competent execution leads to disaster. And history is full of examples from local governments to entire nations where revolutionary rhetoric collided with economic reality, and the people who suffered most were the very communities those revolutionaries claimed to represent. Here's something fascinating from the polling data. Among American-born New Yorkers, there's still a preference for Cuomo over Mamdani. Not overwhelming, but measurable. Among foreign-born New Yorkers, particularly recent immigrants, the numbers flip dramatically. We're talking about something like 60 to 25% in favor of Mamdani. Why is that significant? Because it suggests that people who have lived through the consequences of progressive governance over the past several years are skeptical of going even further left. But people who are newer to the city, who perhaps haven't experienced the decline firsthand, or who come from countries where socialism is presented as an ideal rather than a failed experiment, are more receptive to Mamdani's message. And this isn't just about New York. This pattern is playing out in cities across America. The question is, what happens when these experiments fail? When the policies that sound compassionate on paper lead to business exodus, tax revenue collapse, and spiraling social problems? Do voters course correct, or do they double down? That's what makes the next few years so critical. But let's zoom out for a moment, because New York's mayoral race, as important as it is to 8 million people, is really just a microcosm of something much larger happening across the country. We're living through a moment of profound political realignment. The old categories left and right, Democrat and Republican, liberal and conservative, they're still useful, but they don't capture what's really going on. What we're really seeing is a battle between two fundamentally different approaches to governance. On one side, you have the belief that the primary job of government is to deliver results, to solve problems, to make people's lives tangibly better. This approach is pragmatic, often messy, sometimes controversial, but ultimately judged by outcomes. Did crime go down? Did the economy improve? Are people safer and more prosperous than they were 4 years ago? On the other side, you have the belief that government's primary job is to advance social justice, to correct historical wrongs, to restructure society according to ideological principles. This approach prioritizes process over outcomes, equity over equality, and often measures success not by whether things got better for everyone, but by whether the right groups were elevated and the right targets were taken down. Trump's announcement about the cartel crackdown is a perfect example of the first approach. He didn't convene a commission to study the problem. He didn't launch a listening tour to hear from stakeholders. He identified a threat, assembled a team, gave them clear objectives, and empowered them to act. And it worked. Measurably, undeniably. That doesn't mean it was perfect. It doesn't mean there weren't trade-offs or controversies. But it means that when you evaluate it on results, there's no comparison to what came before. Now contrast that with how many cities have approached rising crime. They've held community forums, they've funded pilot programs, they've created oversight committees and advisory boards. And meanwhile, carjackings doubled. Retail theft became so rampant that stores started closing. Subway riders started avoiding certain lines because they didn't feel safe. That's the difference between results-oriented governance and process-oriented governance. And here's what concerns me most. We're at a point where the gap between these two approaches is so wide that we're almost speaking different languages. One side talks about metrics and outcomes. The other side talks about narratives and systemic issues. One side wants to know, did it work? The other side wants to know, was it fair? Both questions matter. But when you can't even agree on which question to ask first, how do you govern? This brings us back to Trump's announcement and why it matters so much beyond just the immediate policy implications. What Trump did was remind Americans that decisive action is possible. That government can function quickly and effectively when leaders are willing to cut through bureaucracy, ignore critics, and focus relentlessly on outcomes. For years, we've been conditioned to accept that everything takes forever, that meaningful change requires decades of coalition building and consensus, that moving fast means cutting corners and ignoring important voices. But what if that's not true? What if the real reason things move slowly is because the system has become calcified by special interests, risk-averse bureaucrats, and politicians who care more about optics than outcomes? Trump's cartel crackdown is a test case. If it continues to produce results, if the numbers keep improving, if American communities start to feel safer, it validates the argument that speed and decisiveness matter. That the old way of doing things wasn't just slow, it was ineffective. And that terrifies the establishment. Because if people realize that government can work efficiently, they'll start demanding it. They'll stop accepting excuses. They'll stop rewarding politicians who talk a good game but never deliver. That's why the backlash has been so intense. That's why every action Trump takes is immediately challenged, investigated, and litigated. Not because his opponents genuinely believe he's breaking the law, but because they understand that if he succeeds, it exposes decades of their own failure. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not saying Trump is perfect. I'm not saying every decision he makes is correct. I'm not even saying you should support him politically. What I'm saying is that we need to be honest about what's happening. We need to look at results, not just rhetoric. We need to ask hard questions about why certain policies work and others don't, regardless of who proposes them. Because here's the truth. America doesn't have unlimited time to figure this out. The drug crisis is killing tens of thousands of people every year. The border is a mess. Cities are struggling. The national debt is spiraling. Our adversaries, China, Russia, Iran, are watching closely, probing for weakness, waiting for opportunities. We can't afford another decade of dysfunction. We can't afford to prioritize political point scoring over problem solving. We can't afford leaders who are more interested in protecting their own power than serving the people who elected them. So, what happens next? In the coming weeks and months, expect the investigations into Trump's cartel operations to intensify. Expect